Good evening, everybody, and I warmly welcome you all to yet another Horizons discussion organized by the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. We're also celebrating this week the 5th anniversary of the founding of this think tank. We like to think of ourselves as one of the most significant think tanks in this part of the world. I think the past 5 years have been an extraordinary journey trying to establish the Center for Excellence, Center for Understanding of Global Affairs in this part of the world, in a country that once used to be very globalized, very international, but has gone through a difficult period which some of us would argue hasn't ended yet. Some people in high places claim that we're also a key hub for international money laundering and violent extremism, but we're not going to confirm or deny that tonight because we have other things to debate. We're also proudly launching the newest issue of our journal, Horizons, our quarterly journal of international relations and sustainable development. We've been privileged to publish exclusive pieces and essays from people, interesting people from all over the world, from Jean-Claude Juncker to Sergei Lavrov, from Jeffrey Sachs to Joseph Nye, from Neil Ferguson to Kevin Rudd and Ahmed Davutoglu, amongst many others. But today we're going to talk about the world affairs. We're also going to try and dive into some philosophical issues about democracy with one of my best friends, an old friend, John Rendon. And well, please welcome John Rendon here.
After a few thousand years, we say it's long-time friend, not old friend.
But wait until I introduce him. He's one of, without exaggeration, he's one of the best informed people about what's going on in the world. And I never asked him how, but he is, take my word for it. He's a former executive director and political director of the Democratic Party of America. He's also a former director of scheduling in advance for President Jimmy Carter. And for the past 30 years, actually over 30 years, now he's been an advisor to the National Security Committee of successive United States governments. And most of the time, believe it or not, they do take his advice, but not always. I remember a situation where he strongly advised them in the race for United Nations Secretary General, and they didn't take his advice. Although the whole thing looked a little bit like a basket case at the beginning, but it didn't end up entirely disastrously in the end. But now he's lecturing at Harvard and Berkeley, and this is not his first time in Belgrade. Some of you here in the audience were privileged to hear from him before in the advanced course on geopolitics and world affairs that the CIRSD gave a few years ago here in Belgrade. So now join me in warmly welcoming John to Belgrade after you heard all that. John, before I start asking you questions, do you have a statement for the audience?
It's a pleasure to be back, and I look forward to your questions and a dialogue with the red light. Thank you.
That's great.
He's responsible for red light.
The first thing that I'd like to ask you about is a more broad question about democracy, because this is something that we continue to debate here in Serbia. But since you spent last few years, if I'm not mistaken, lecturing at Harvard and Berkeley, about the impact of technology on democratic process. And you and I talked, we even put it in the title of tonight's discussion, Fake News and Bots, which America discovered in 2016 in a big way during the presidential elections. I must say that Serbia can proudly claim to have known about bots and fake news even 4 years before you, but we're not going to talk about Serbia. What is the impact of bots and fake news? Is it growing, and is democracy really at threat from them? And what is it that one can do about it?
Given your experience 4 years earlier, I sort of wish we had this discussion 6 years ago. Important to establish some parameters. First off, these are John's observations. You've probably seen a TED Talk. This is John's version of a TED Talk. This is not policy or positions of the United States government, any government, planets, or solar systems. Just my view. That being said, fake news has become a political characterization, but underpinning that is the question of facts. So my experience, to the extent I have any, is that facts are pieces of information that are picked up and moved along. Now, facts can only have one of two characteristics. You can have a true fact, or you can have a false fact. There is no such thing as an alternative fact. The challenge in this, and I think you have seen this firsthand, tragically, and we've seen it in the United States, the British have seen it during Brexit, is misinformation and disinformation are built on foundations of false facts. If it is artfully constructed, there will be a handful of true facts in that foundation, which makes attacks against the false facts very hard to do without drilling down to details people don't care about. That is the art in it, and we witnessed it in the United States for the first time on a scale that we had never seen before. And I think a lot of people didn't know it was taking place until probably the summer before the election. Now, bots and fake news, they are different, but they are related. So what happened with bots, which are online robots, as many of you may know, they were used differently. If you have spent any time online and happen to be, not just Serbian, but also a netizen, part of the net, I would tell you I'm a longtime nerd. And in that case, you've probably been chased by high school classmates on Facebook. You've probably shopped in the great fulfillment factory called Amazon, and you may or may not chase little blue birds. If you have done any one of those three activities, not to mention the extraordinary amount beyond that online, somebody already knows everything about you. If you've done 7 clicks, you've given away your identity to somebody. Now, the institutions will tell you that is to enhance the user experience. The people to whom they sell that information use it to achieve objectives. And that's where the bots came into play in the 2016 election in the United States, but also in the Brexit election previously. Because what happened was malevolent forces created false identities and then created those identities online using Facebook and Instagram and Twitter to move the content along that had the foundations of false facts. And that's when the two things got driven together. And they did it with such a degree of sophistication that it elevated the content into a political discourse targeting groups on the far left in the United States, like Black Lives Matter, and on the far right in the United States, as in the Tea Party and some supremacist movements. And then that debate took off on its own, always sourcing back to the original content. And that is something that had a profound effect in the election in altering the public discourse.
But the question is, I remember having this conversation here in this room with Richard Haas and some of the others. I understand that it was a very sophisticated and a thought-through operation. Now, my question is, you have two very powerful poles in the country, Republican Party and the Democrat Party, and they all raised about $1 to $1.5 billion for the 2016 election. So how is it possible that these guys who have raised $1.5 billion didn't think about it? How is it possible that they did not use some of this money in order to do something similar or counter these forces? I mean, how is it possible that for as much as about $10 million, when I believe that the Mueller's indictment talks about millions of dollars, how is it possible that millions of dollars managed to totally skew the process that was funded by about like $3 billion by the parties?
Yeah, it's called nudging. If you've got an object coming towards Earth, let's just say it's an asteroid or a comet, and it's about to collide, you're a lot better off to hit it much further out and just nudge it so that its trajectory alters than it is to wait for it to be right here. Mm-hmm. So the fake news, bot attacks happened so far away that nobody saw it transpiring. And so they continue to do business as usual in our campaigns, which have become, dangerously expensive.
So basically, you're having another election next Tuesday, and
So I've heard.
Yeah. So it's basically it's an important election, and we can dwell into why and what do you think would be the outcome. But do you observe in this midterm election the same kind of operations?
Yes, we're seeing. Or authorities are seeing malevolent actors trying to alter the discussion in the United States. Again.
And are they concentrated in certain districts or like swing states or swing districts,
Yep.
whatnot?
They're targeting the most vulnerable seats in the election to try to tip it one way or another.
But now with this experience of 2016, what are you doing about it?
Yeah, so we had a conversation in the summer of 16 when the story became public that there were malevolent actors inside the United States trying to alter the election. And candidly, I'm not one of the people that believe they had a predetermined outcome in mind. Okay, I think the strategy at play in the United States, not different than other places in Europe, is to divide countries internally and then divide them from each other. I think that was the ultimate strategy. So not caring who won, just having a divided country. And clearly in the United States, that approach was successful. So the conversation we had in the summer of 16 is unlike the threat of nuclear war, where there was a mutual assured destruction dynamic and, the notion of proportionate response with two great powers, the Soviet Union at the time and the United States. That nobody really wanted to go into a nuclear war because nobody would survive a nuclear war. And there's this notion of proportionate response. You do something, I'll do something, you do something, and that doesn't lead anywhere. The challenge in cyber is any action in cyber is seen as escalatory in nature. So it is not a proportionate response, it's an extra proportionate response, which means the adversary doesn't stop doing what they're doing, they do more of something else. And it just escalates beyond control. I think the only way to deal with it is to turn the lights on and call it out. And there was an attempt to do that, and I think this will probably be in the media sometime this fall if it's not already. So Donna Brazil, who was the chairperson of the Democratic Party, reached out privately to Reince Priebus, who would later be the chief of staff to President Trump, when he was head of the Republican Party, and said, look, we've been attacked in cyber. I want to explain to you everything that happened in the attack to the Democratic Party that we've learned from law enforcement authorities and share it with you in order to protect the Republicans from being attacked similarly. Now, what will come out in the story is he never returned the phone call, never responded to the letter. That raises all sorts of other conspiracy theories. But I think the only way to do this is total transparency. You turn the lights on and you say to the people of the country in which this attack is taking place, this is an attack.
So basically, it was like a ruling party at a time, like reaching out to the opposition, saying like,
Correct.
like this. All right. So this would be as if, like, for example, here the ruling party comes and warns the opposition that some nasty things that are unethical are happening.
So you would know whether that's realistic or not. In the United States, that actually happened. So there are responsible actors in both parties.
So basically, now that we're talking about the midterm elections, they're happening on Tuesday. So, so what do you expect? What do you expect Washington? What do you expect America is going to look like on Wednesday morning? What is your prediction? Not just in terms of the result, but in terms of what would be the implications for the next 2 years prior to the 2020?
So first off, and I've been telling a number of people this, I'm not seeing the blue wave. So this notion that there's going to be an overwhelming Democratic victory, it's the reason I wore blue, in case you missed that. But I'm not seeing the blue wave, which means I'm not seeing a sweep by Democrats because they're Democrats. I am seeing that the House will change parties from Republican to Democrat because of exceptionally strong candidates. And one of the sets of those candidates, what I failed to say about my background is I'm from Boston. Go Red Sox.
Yeah.
But also we export politics as part of our DNA. And one of our younger members of Congress, who is a sophomore, Seth Moulton, Marine captain, tours in Iraq, for the last 18 months has been recruiting combat veterans to run as Democrats in marginal Republican seats, and has 21 that survived the nomination process. It'll be very interesting to see how they do in the general election in 1 week. But two of the strongest candidates are pilots. One was a search and rescue pilot, Black Hawks in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and she takes no crap from anybody. This is somebody who's been there, done it, and they can't call her into question. And the other one is an F-18 pilot, and she flew off carriers in the Indian Ocean and the Med in combat operations, and she's not taking no for an answer either. So Seth's done a good job in recruiting candidates. Need 29 to change the House. The projections today are as high as 48. I don't see that, but I do see them changing hands. Now on the Senate side, it's a different story. I think on the Senate side, we will lose seats in the Senate, and there'll be a Republican plus-up of probably 2 or 3 going in. So then your next question, since I heard that thought out here someplace, what happens to impeachment? I think impeachment is a really bad move politically. The country's already divided, and I would rather see the president not reelected than removed from office, despite his behavior and his policies. We have a constitution, we should follow the constitution.
Yeah, but the thing is, like, it's not very likely that the president can be impeached because there is no 2/3 in the Senate for that. Now, the question is whether the impeachment procedure actually helps the election perspectives for Democrats in 2020.
Now, Sally, my sense is, which is what makes the last 30 days at a political level fascinating. So I think pushing for impeachment would mobilize Trump's base and keep them mobile and active forever. I think going through the normal electoral process, allowing things to be debated out, makes him much more vulnerable. But he is not guaranteed to lose the election. You have to beat somebody, you have to beat Trump with somebody. Right now, we have 20 candidates on the Democratic side vying for it. The first reduction in candidates will come in March of next year based on fundraising, their ability to keep an effort going. And then the second round will also be based on fundraising, which will probably be in September. And then you'll have a field of 5 to 7 candidates. They'll have to go into a contest. Now, when I said the last 30 days were interesting to me, the United States got captivated in the Supreme Court nomination of Kavanaugh. And it was a very intense debate across the country. Now, at a political level, I think that Trump wanted Kavanaugh to be defeated in the U.S. Senate because it would mobilize his base through the general election, which will take place.
So you mean like if Kavanaugh was
rejected,
rejected, then he would make sure that all angry people come out and vote?
Yes, his base would come out.
And this time, this way, it's somebody else who's angry and who's more likely to turn out and vote.
I mean, the reality is that Trump has the votes in the Senate to get anybody confirmed for anything. So the notion that there would not be a conservative member of the Supreme Court was just not realistic. He was going to get a conservative member of the Supreme Court no matter what. Chose Kavanaugh, potentially a flawed candidate, a personal observation. Clearly in the news media, one can still see that's out there, to generate a very intense debate, which mobilized his base. But when Kavanaugh was confirmed, the base slowed down and stopped doing things. And then, not that I'm a conspiracy theorist, and not that I'm in the part of the world today that believes in conspiracy theories, but of 35 years of doing whatever it is I really do, which is have coffee with friends, there are no coincidences, period. And the existence of the caravan leaving Central America headed for the southern border of the United States is not a coincidence and has captivated the attention of the United States and voters in the United States and voters in marginal districts in the United States for the last 3 weeks, with one exception, with 3 exceptions, which I'll get to in a second. But also a big believer in Shakespeare.
Me too.
You know, first soliloquies, right, on stage. But when the president was at a campaign rally in Montana 3 weeks ago, he said that Democrats created the caravan. And that falls right into the category of methinks he doth protest too much. But it'll be interesting because at some point we'll have investigative journalists, I'm sure, that will go down and track this all the way to what we would call in contagions, patient zero, and figure out whose idea this caravan was. Because when it first started, all the signs were in English, not in Spanish. It got resupplied pretty intensely, food and water, and there were vehicles, and it got resupplied as it moved out of Honduras through Central America. So for those aspiring young investigative journalists, that's a story I would go look at. Now, what altered the debate, sorry to keep going, Democrat, I can filibuster. The tragic events in the United States from Pittsburgh to Kroger and elsewhere captivated the attention of the United States and froze every other story out. And so there is this leveling that's taking place now.
By the way, you mentioned Seth Moulton. He's a friend, and in 2016, Kennedy School named Seth and me as the 2 most promising alumni, and obviously they were only 50% right, but I was really
so Seth
privileged.
will make it eventually.
No, all jokes aside, but I would like to now shift into world affairs that center around America as the most powerful nation on earth. Last week we had in Belgrade a prominent Chinese scholar who spoke about China and who spoke about the Belt and Road and who spoke about how China views the world and the future of the U.S.-China relationship, which is arguably the most important bilateral relationship of our times. Now, I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked him. The last couple of months seem to be, something very important seemed to be happening. And perhaps Kevin Rudd wrote recently that 2018 may be looked back by future historians as the year when the new Cold War started, when America shifted from the era of engagement with China to era of confrontation. You had Vice President Mike Pence deliver a big speech bashing China in very, very harsh terms, but it doesn't only seem to be top levels of Trump administration. It seems to be more of an institutionalized shift. We see this in New America's defense strategy, in New America's national security strategy. Is it really changing? Are China and America becoming strategic competitors, if not outright adversaries?
So the whole notion of yin and yang is the ability to hold two competing points of view with a degree of simultaneity, so at the same time. So we have to, in the West, learn how to compete and collaborate with the same people against the same objective at the same time. That is sort of the Eastern mindset. We're much more transactional, yes, no, black, white, red, green. The world is more of a relationship economy than a transaction economy. But we've entered into a new level of non-engagement with the Chinese, which is dangerous. And it can lead to mistakes, and mistakes can lead to really bad things happening on somebody else's territory. So for years during the Cold War, in contests between the United States and the Soviet Union, there were proxy wars fought out in other countries. That is a risk with China. There has yet to be the China discussion in the United States.
But I remember 2007 and the then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton being asked about China, and it was in the context of human rights. And she was criticized for Obama's administration. No, it was 2009, sorry. 2009, it was Hillary, and it was post-Obama. Well, Obama was president. She was asked, like, why didn't you criticize China on human rights records? And she said, like, you can't be tough and you're a banker. Now, China's arguably much more of a banker in 2018 than it was in 2008. Nonetheless, America's attitude seems to be changing. And again, this is not just Trump and his entourage. It seems to be like a much wider sentiment.
Yeah, so it is led by President Trump, and it's led off campaign promises. President Trump is determined to implement every campaign promise that he made in the 2016 campaign, whether it is good for the United States or not. Therein lies the challenge. But as you raise, Mrs. Clinton's comments, I want to take you to 2011. President Obama's running for re-election. His poll numbers are low, and the Chinese send somebody to have a conversation with Madeleine Albright, a Democrat, and with Vince Weber, a Republican, member of the House, former Republican leader, I think the state of Minnesota. And which makes perfect sense politically, right? You got a weak president running for re-election. They want to figure out what's going to happen, like any great power would. Probably all embassies were reporting back anyway on what was transpiring in the election. But that's not what they were interested in. So what they asked Madeleine Albright and also Vin Weber was the same thing. Forget for a second, as I tell this story, that the foundation of their question was flawed. But think about the nature of the question. So at that time, we had just gone through Occupy Wall Street 99%. which were self-organizing systems of the street versus elites. And the Chinese asked Madeleine Albright to find two other Democrats to have a conversation about what the Democratic Party did to undermine a popular movement. What levers of power did they use? So hold that thought right there. And they asked Vin Weber, as I mentioned, a leader in the House, or a former leader in the House at the time, to find two Republicans, because the Republican Party, when faced with the Tea Party, which was a popular movement, I have to remind people from Boston, it's the second Tea Party, not the first one. We had the first one. But because the Chinese believed that the Republican Party had undermined the second Tea Party with levers of power the Republican Party possessed. The takeaway from this is not just did they not understand the political dynamics of the United States, they are afraid of their own people more than they are afraid of external forces. And they need levers of power to control popular movements.
Yeah, but when it comes to China, and China believes that I'm quoting our last week's guest that America is trying to contain China, and the Chinese believe that America is like caught in their mind. They're caught back in the 20th century, where arguably successfully America managed to contain the Soviet Union based on Kennan's idea from the long telegram right after the end of the Second World War that eventually led to the situation in which the Soviet Union imploded. Well, China believes that containment is not going to work because China's too big, China's too connected, China's too intertwined with the United States when it comes to economy, at least. First of all, do you believe that at least the current U.S. government is harboring hopes and ideas of containing China, and is it doable?
So many questions, so little time. Sorry. I don't think the current Trump administration is trying to contain China. I think it sees China through the optics of trade. It sees China through the optics of the South China Sea and even North Korea, and is trying to deal with each of those issues. But containment with China would never work. The challenge is you want to avoid a really bad contest that leads to something far worse. And with respect to the Cold War, and I understand the observation because it's easier to do that, but I think we've shifted from a Cold War to a hot peace, and that hot peace is manifesting itself more in Europe than it is in the Pacific.
All right, so you mentioned North Korea, and obviously it's a very interesting topic, and early on in Trump's presidency, with fire and fury, and it looked at some point, it seemed as if we were on the brink of something terribly serious in the Far East, in Asia Pacific. First of all, were we really close, or was it just acting?
Yeah, so there are a number of people on the planet Earth, other planets are a little bit different, that believe loose nuclear elements are a bad idea for carbon life forms. I am one of those people. So I can tell you that I have no trouble sleeping at night today, and I had a lot of trouble sleeping at night going into the summer of 17. Yeah, I think things got really close, and because of a lot of participation on both sides, the world found its way out of what could have been a horrific disaster.
I know from our previous conversations that you're generally optimistic. We're not talking about deadlines, we're not talking about horizons, but you're generally optimistic with regard to détente and rapprochement in Korea. But let's imagine for a second that things really start going well, not necessarily overnight, but they really start going well, and that there is a motion towards reunification of Korea on terms yet to be determined, and so on and so forth. But let's say that one of the premises of the reunification is fulfilled, and this is full denuclearization of the peninsula.
By both countries' definition.
Yeah, but the thing is that, there are a lot of people who are very, skeptical whether or not this is doable or not. But let's say for the sake of the argument that this is doable. But that full denuclearization of the peninsula comes hand in hand with a total American military withdrawal from the peninsula. Would that be a good deal for America?
I think containing and reducing the number of nuclear weapons anywhere in the world is a great idea, one. Two, there are currently two competing schools of thought or two views of what's transpiring on the Korean Peninsula. One, which is an old Cold War view, is that the North Koreans continue to develop weapons of mass destruction and the ability to deliver them, and this is all a gambit, a giant gambit, designed to slow the West in general, the U.S. in particular, down. And there's another school of thought that sees this, that under the young leader's approach, KJU, who spent some of his formative years in Europe and Switzerland, saw what else is out there, looked at Japan and sees Japan as a greater threat to them than the United States, looks at Russia, doesn't trust Russia, looks at Chinese subservience, and looks for another way into the future. I'm closer to that point of view than the subterfuge. The reality about deployment of U.S. forces is the United States military can move massive amounts of forces anywhere in the world inside of 24 hours as a blocking force to any other action that takes place, particularly with air power associated with it. That's only a handful of hours to get there in order to contain.
Withdrawing from South Korea doesn't make too much of a difference because you can shift like a couple of fleets.
Yeah, so I mean, the question would really be, our forces in South Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, were deployed there during the Korean War and immediately thereafter. So take a look at the size and capability of an aircraft carrier in the United States Navy at the end of World War II versus an aircraft carrier in the United States Navy today. The order of magnitude of capability is literally somewhere between 10 and 15x greater with today's carrier, where you'd have to have 10 or 15 other carriers from World War II. So our ability to have global reach and a global strike power increases every day. It doesn't diminish. So I think the notion of whether U.S. forces are on the peninsula or not is not material to the safety of South Korea.
So what do you think then the Japanese, at least according to the discourse in their media and general public, why do you think that the Japanese feel so agitated about this whole thing and come across as the skeptics in chief of any kind of rapprochement?
Yeah, so I don't blame them. I mean, they've had 20 missiles fired over their territory in the experimental testing stage. I'd be a little nervous about that, too. This is the trust but verify dynamic.
So let's switch gears and let's go to the part of the world that is much closer to us, which is the Middle East, and that preoccupies world headlines, and in particular in the light of the Khashoggi affair that shook the world, that shook the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and potentially shook the relationship between the kingdom and the United States. But before we go into this strategic aspect of it, like quite simply, as an outsider, as an educated outsider, do you think that the MBS knew what was going on?
About what?
About like you come in peace, you leave in pieces.
Shot while trying to escape. I think that was the line in Casablanca.
Yeah.
First off, I don't know what MBS knew or didn't know. And I think speculation in any one of these situations without firsthand knowledge is always dangerous because it sends conversation sideways. What I do know is the person who was murdered in the Turkish embassy was a resident of the United States of America and a contributing journalist to the Washington Post. Whoever told somebody that was a good idea to murder that individual either does not know the world or does not know the United States or wants to remove MBS from power. Because this was a colossal mistake. And the size of this mistake won't fully be known for months. But one can already begin to see the shift in a U.S. relationship with the kingdom over the kingdom and the Emirates' engagement in Yemen. The Department of Defense Secretary Mattis informed the Saudis several hours ago that they have to go to the table with the Houthis in 30 days or risk the potential of an end to U.S. military support in Yemen. That's a big change. I think you'll see other changes.
So what do you think? What do you think that the U.S. military support for the Yemen operation is so crucial, given that Saudi Arabia has been buying for years, and in particular, in the last years, like tens, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of equipment that is supposed to be highly superior to anything that, for example, Iran can provide to its proxies. So how is it possible that they've gone to this disastrous situation?
So there's a word in English. I'm not sure if you have it in Serbian. Chances are you do. It's called corruption. So hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons procurement in the kingdom, and when they went to go use the equipment, some of it had not been maintained. A lot of people hadn't been trained on it, and a lot of money probably wound up closer to Serbia in Switzerland than it did in Riyadh or in Jeddah, among other places. So they found out they spent a lot of money that didn't wind up buying what had been purchased.
Okay, so we touched upon Iran. This is obviously, it's one of the rivalries, arguably one of the key rivalries, if not the rivalry in the Middle East, that dates back to the early age of Islam, the rivalry between Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It seems like Obama's idea was to try and establish some kind of a balance of power in the Middle East. That's one of the logics, one of the explanations of what motivated the nuclear deal with Iran. Unlike Obama, Mr. Trump seemed to be doubling down on support to allies, going to great lengths to support them. Saudi Arabia was one example, but also Israel with a decision to move the embassy and so on and so forth. So America seems to be doubling down when it comes to supporting allies in the Middle East against what they perceive as adversaries or threats, starting with Iran. So how do you see this play out in the aftermath of the colossal mistake committed in the context of the Khashoggi affair?
You've probably gathered by now I'm a storyteller. So my answer begins with a story. Everybody knows where they were on September 11th, 2001. I mean, just a huge event. I was actually in Puerto Rico with the U.S. Navy trying to solve a local political problem. Came back into Washington, and nobody really knew what was next. It was just a very uncertain period of time. We had a bus loose in the state of Tennessee, a Greyhound bus, not responding to the dispatcher, and we wondered whether that was a terrorist action. And then, for those that remember, there was an American Airlines plane that lost a rudder over LaGuardia and crashed, and we didn't know if that was a terrorist attack. And then some young boy, I don't know, 14, 16 years old, flew a plane into an office building in Tampa, Florida. And that got everybody's attention. And the reason for that, for those of you that don't know that, right, Tampa is the headquarters for U.S. Central Command, and it's also the headquarters for U.S. Special Operations Command. Both commands were hyperactive at the moment because of the threat coming from al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and that's the two commands that were most active at the time. So that then posed the question, look, we can't live day to day trying to figure out what's next, what's a terrorist attack, what's not. And so over the period of time, and I've talked about this publicly before, we went and conducted focus groups. I think I actually talked about it when I was here last. We conducted focus groups, which are market research, with young Muslims in every country that had a Muslim population, whether it was minority or majority. And these were young Muslims, 16 to 20, 21 to 25, gender divided. And so we wanted to hear from them how they saw what was transpiring in order to build from that basically a threat matrix, which we did. However, when we conducted those interviews, or when those interviews were conducted in Iran, Iran was disproportionately pro-Western. Really pro-Western. Matched the next country down in the Middle East region that was pro-Western, which was Lebanon, which makes sense because of a religious divide and because of their dependency on trading, right? They need, a calm environment in order to succeed. So later on, probably 2004, 2005, when the Bush administration was engaged with the regime in Tehran, there was a microphone war that went on between the two capitals, between Washington and Tehran. What we noticed in Iran at the time, and cautioned people, was when the United States makes it about Iran, it creates a nationalistic feeling which is unifying around the central governing authority. So the best thing to do in that situation, a number of people suggested, including me, is don't engage. There is no penalty for not responding. But if the response leads to a solidification of the regime, that's a real challenge. So now, fast forward into when you asked this question, we have the Trump administration, whose policy foundation is probably reverse all things Obama, one, and two, fulfill every campaign promise. So that's the rationale of the policy. In the case of Iran, and we did talk a little bit about this earlier, so if there is a Trump doctrine, and this is John's view of it, not anybody else's, the Trump doctrine would be this: we don't care what happens inside your borders. Two,
That's terribly encouraging.
okay. So laissez-faire domestically. If you're busy in your neighborhood, you will get our attention, and the U.S. will make a judgment on that. If one is expeditionary, going outside their neighborhood to cause a problem, you're really going to get the attention of the United States, and you really don't want that attention. That's my view to characterize speeches that I've listened to and discussions I've had in other places. So with respect to Iran, if it's keep every campaign promise, and reverse all things Obama, the nuclear deal, which took a lot of work, particularly in Europe, is gone. Which then, ironically, creates a division between the United States of America and its European allies that participated in the construction of that deal, and doesn't fundamentally change Iran's behavior. Iran, on the other hand, is far more vulnerable to criticism of being a drug trafficker because it is. Its Secret Service moves drugs from Afghanistan and Pakistan into the country and then distributes it to Europe and in the Middle East or down into the Gulf states. And it's vulnerable to that attack without losing the European coalition, because Europe, you know, like everybody else, victims of drug trafficking, which is coming out of that part of the world.
It was really funny. We recently established a direct flight from Tehran to Belgrade, and until very recently, we even had a short-lived visa-free regime for Iranian citizens. It really it came to my mind now that you're mentioning this. But if everything goes according to the tangent, and the Trump continues to fulfill his campaign promises, and the Europeans do not find a vehicle for the European companies that want to do business with Iran and be able to avoid American sanctions, and this continues to solidify the nationalist feeling in Tehran. So what is your prediction? When is it that Iran is going to start doing their nuclear thing again, saying like, look, there's no point in us continuing with the good behavior? When do you predict that this may happen? How far away in the future? And if that happens, what will be the America's response? So,
One, I don't know. Two, what makes you think that hasn't started? I'm not sure we're going to know. I mean, but that's the kind of situation that could easily take us to the brink of another war. And I think we have to take that very seriously. I think the regime in Tehran is enormously vulnerable to its own population, not just because they were pro-Western, you know, almost 20 years ago, but because the regime knows what the rest of the people in the country know what the rest of the world looks like, and they don't like their government. You know, and left to their own devices.
When you say government, you mean Rouhani, or you mean the Revolutionary Guard?
The Revolutionary Guards.
Well, I can also think of a country that elected a pro-cosmopolitan government and then ended up receiving, you know, tough love from the world, and then it didn't end up
no first-hand experience
well.
with that?
No, well, yeah, just I knew people who served in such administrations. But do you think that in the next 10 years, we're now going to get into the last round of questions, and I would like them to be shorter answers. Do you think that...
That was a hint. So that means no stories.
No stories.
Okay, I got it.
So do you think that there are going to be border changes in the Middle East in the next 5 to 10 years?
Border changes? No.
Right. So
No story, just an answer.
And do you think that the current borders that exist on maps could be upheld in reality?
So you have to tell me what you're really asking.
I'm asking you about Syria and Iraq.
Oh, okay. I was in a different part. So I do see the border in Syria changing. Yeah. I'm not sure how. Syria is not good for any contributing country at the moment. That includes Russia, the United States, Turkey, and others. It's not even good for Iran. So everybody wants to find a deal, and the question is who makes the deal.
Good.
But yeah, that border, I can see that border changing.
So let's fast forward to our part of the world. Let's fast forward to Europe. I'm not going to ask you long questions about Europe. I'm going to ask you to try and give me a yes or no answers on some questions, and I'm not going to
Yes,
take
no, no, yes, no, yes.
I'm not going to take it depends as an answer.
Okay.
So John, you need to bet. You can only bet yes or no. Do you think Macron is going to be reelected?
Yes.
And do you think that Euro is going to survive?
Yes.
Is Brexit going to happen?
No.
And is there going to be...
Well, so the question on Brexit, is that in the UK or in other countries?
So if you're trying to say that it's not a question if Brexit is going to occur, the question is how many more exits?
Right.
Oh, good. So that's a different answer. Is there going to be an enlargement of the European Union in the next 10 years?
Yes.
Great. So I'm now going to go to the something wider. You have been advising successive American governments for about 30 years, but since the end of the Cold War, since 1990, all the way until today, if you were to pick one thing, now with the benefit of hindsight, if you were to pick one thing that you could undo in terms of what the American government did or did not do, if you were to reverse an action or inaction of an American government, and if you were, limited to just one thing, what would you personally undo about America?
I mean, the short answer would be not invest in Apple. Also a Mac head. So I believe the single biggest threat with which the United States is confronted is unplugging from the rest of the world.
Unplugging.
Unplugging. So therefore, I think increased visa restrictions and the actions engaging between the United States and the rest of the world on access to the United States is the decision I would change.
So not Iraq.
I think you said one.
No. And
So
I meant
if
one.
there are more, I've got others, but
No,
and that would be on
no
the
worries.
list.
It
But
wouldn't be fair. I asked you for one. So what are the top three things as a citizen of the world that worry you most?
So how much time can I take on this answer?
Well, very little.
That's a shame. Somebody has to follow up. So we'll stack the deck. So I worry about shifts in warfare. I think bullets and bombs are the 20th century. I think IPOs and purchase and sale agreements are weapons in the 21st century. I really worry about education. And I worry about education because we've lost critical thinking. I tell young analysts, young people with whom I speak, is when you go online now and you search, you only search to prove yourself right. Try going on to prove yourself wrong and ask yourself what you're missing. Because we can always get our point of view better, but we're not accepting a different point of view. And I think we have to accept critical thinking in order to have civilized discourse. The third piece is the absence of civilized discourse. You have to recognize there are people with different points of view, whether they're in government or in opposition. And once you recognize them, you have to respect their existence, even if you hold a completely different point of view. If you can do those two things, you can get to a civilized outcome and not a polarized outcome, because it's too easy to shrink back in on oneself. And then there is one that really does keep me up at night, which deals with the evolution of violent extremism. And I am going to take a little bit on this because it's really important. So look, I will be completely candid. I see three parallel universes. First universe are people that have left home, have been trained, and are en route to the United States or to coalition partners to do harm to the homeland. And I'm going to be perfectly blunt about that. We're going to hunt them down and kill them before they get to the border. We're not going to allow something to happen inside the country. We're going to protect people's kids and their grandkids. The second group are people that have left home. They're getting help from illicit facilitators. They're getting housing, transportation, documents, money, and ultimately training. They're largely kids, and that's what countering violent extremism needs to be. And a bunch of old white guys like me are not the right messengers to them. The right messengers to them are former terrorists who have been in that network, found out that it's fraudulent, have left, and can speak to them again about why it doesn't make sense. The other group that needs to speak to this countering violent extremism have to be the sons and daughters, the brothers and sisters of people who have gone in and of people who have been victims of that violence. It's the third universe I lose sleep over. Today, while we're in this room in Belgrade, there are young children, 6 to 8 years old, and they're playing football, not American football, real football, in Jakarta, in Jeddah, in Djibouti. They may have play dates scheduled or whatever it's called in their respective cultures. And something can radicalize them in the next 10 years, and they look for the terrorist pipeline. If we don't unify globally at a way to make that alternative future unacceptable, not cool to those kids, this never ends. Or if it ends very, very poorly. And this is something that requires a civilized discourse and true leadership, not followership, true leadership to get out there and figure out a way to shut that pipeline down, not by denying access, but by getting to a position where the people who want a future don't see that as acceptable. And that's what I lose sleep over.
Well, that was... My last question to you is going to be...
About the Red Sox.
Not about the Red Sox. I'm just like this bipolar guy between the Red Sox and the Yankees. That totally doesn't come into picture. But there are a lot of young people here in the room, and you are lecturing you're lecturing leadership courses at Harvard and at Berkeley. What is your single most important message? I'm going to ask you now to be slightly shorter so that I can give a chance to the audience to ask questions. What's your single most important advice for the leaders of tomorrow?
No plan survives contact with reality, 1. 2, conquer fear early. Fear will be an impediment. Just conquer it. Get by it. 3, never give up. If you give up, somebody else wins. And there is nothing you can't do if you put your mind and your heart to it. Passion and intelligence matters. I can train anybody to do anything. Can't train you to be passionate, can't train you to be smart. But if you believe in yourself, there's nothing you can't get done.
I had other questions, but I'm going to stop here. So I'm going to ask you guys if you have a question from the audience. Sir, and then over there. Oops, sorry. Microphone.
Hand up again.
We need a microphone. Yeah. Okay. So first, then, and then you can switch there.
Thank you very much. I'm actually from Canada of Serbian descent, and your presence here in Serbia today reminds me of the old saying that a criminal always returns to the scene of the crime. I've looked.
I like maple syrup.
I've looked up some of your activities, and they say there's and these are mainstream media, not
Sir, I'm going to cut you off there.
Sorry.
I'm going to cut you off there.
no
So,
question, no critical questions?
No, you can ask a question, but you cannot give a statement. This is about questions, sir.
Can I ask
If you
him-
have a question, I'm going to let you ask a question. If you don't have a question, I'm going to pass on the floor to somebody else, okay?
All right, yes.
Please,
Can I
ask
ask
the
him?
question.
Can I ask him to confirm or deny a quote?
You can.
Okay. So the quote I've got here is from The Independent. It says that while you're working for the CIA and the Chief of Staff of the United States military and setting up PR against Saddam and so on, that you have had your hand in the pie in every key U.S. military intervention in the past 20 years, including Kosovo. And that you're a perception manager and you make wars possible. You're called the Sultan of Spin, and that you identify what the malevolent forces are and then organize the bombing. Did you organize the bombing of us? And if you did, why? And what would you suggest that we Serbs could do to get back our Kosovo heartland after your bombing?
So thanks for the question. The answer is no, I didn't organize the bombing.
And I can, and I'm going to give somebody else, but if I would also like to answer possibly the best thing you can do, sir, to help not lose Kosovo is to stop receiving money from this government. Sir.
I'm a journalist. My question is regarding court rules regarding USA and Iran. You know about what I'm thinking because 2 weeks ago some court ordered that USA must obey something, but USA simply say we don't obey your rules, we don't agree with you, etc., etc. What do you think about that behavior of USA regarding the world?
So I don't know about this.
It's actually the ruling of the International Court of Justice. It's the ruling of the International Court of Justice that United States was in violation of the enmity treaty between Iran and the United States that predated the revolution, and I believe the U.S. reaction was that was predating, and the United States basically just withdrew from the treaty and ignored the ruling.
I got it. So I disagree with that policy decision.
The policy decision of the United States government. Okay, let's go on. Sir?
Thank you. I would like to ask, here in the Serbian media, they are saying some stories like that the current US government is like pro-Serbian because of their anti-Islamic policy, because they are like radical against the Muslims. So I would like to ask if that is true, and is current US President Trump more pro-Serbian than before, and what do you think about the idea of a division of Kosovo between our state and the current government down there? That's all.
No, yes, maybe, and yes. No, so I haven't seen a policy statement by the U.S. government, it could be that I just missed it, on the question of a bilateral relationship between Serbia and the United States. So to be able to answer the question, is the current U.S. administration more pro-Serbia than the last administration? I don't have a point of view because I don't know. The worst thing I could do is make up an answer. Too many people in or from Washington do that. So I'd rather just be honest and say I don't have a view on that, and I just don't know.
And what about the vision of Kosovo?
So That issue is gaining some visibility, as you know, and you all know that far better than others. It's getting a little bit more attention in Washington, but it's not going to get any attention at all until we're out of our elections and other issues clear the agenda. Right now, there are a lot of issues that everybody focuses on, and they run from one issue to another. A lot will depend on what the embassy here says and other U.S. embassies in the region say. But I'm not sure the discussion has reached that altitude yet. That doesn't mean it's not important, it just means it hasn't.
Okay, let's go on. Sir, in the back.
Good evening. First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. At the risk of steering away from politics, I'd like to go back to the question on bots. There hasn't been offered an alternative to how to combat a disproportionate effect of bots on democracy. I assume that's probably a long answer, but I'll leave it to you to suggest an option. Thank you.
So I'm going to, thanks for that question. I'm going to hope that you're also a longtime nerd as you ask that question.
Yeah, that was the risk.
Okay. So we have simpatico on that. So there are two things that go on. One is escalation, right, where, okay, so somebody created artificial life forms, identities, elevated them as bots, put them in. So is it possible to write the white hat algorithm which looks for those and then counters them as they move? Absolutely. That won't stop the research and development. The more we lean on technology and lean away from ourselves, the more vulnerable we become to the evolution or the escalation or the enhancement of the capability. Which is why earlier I said critical thinking becomes important, and the ability to have a civilized discourse that's rooted in reality and truth, not supposition, is so important. And I think, you know, as we all become more dependent on technology, I was one of the people that argued everybody should be online. I think we'd be in a stronger position. But if you don't bring along people's ability to think, not to be propagandized, not to believe something that they want to believe rather than something they should believe because they've learned, that's when you're at risk. So yeah, can you do algorithms to fight algorithms? Absolutely. But it never stops because there'll always be something else. The reality is, you know, for how many people in the room will own up to being a nerd? Really, right? Come on. Really?
More.
All right. No young people are nerds? Really? Okay, good. So you know it's possible based on search to learn everything about you. And based on search, you can then target messaging. That's exactly what advertisers do now. When you go on Facebook, whether it's your feed or something else, and you begin to see adverts that are in line with what you've thought, that's because of search, enhance the user experience, as I said before. That can be manipulated politically very easily. And we've seen only the start of that. We haven't seen its fruition in its entirety. But until we learn to question all the information that's in front of us, we're going to be really, really vulnerable to somebody else's manipulation. That's the real challenge.
All right, last round of questions. Sir?
Thank you. What are you think about migration from Middle East to Europe and America want to build a wall to the but I think the
You mean
Europe,
wall to Mexico?
yes, wall to Mexico.
Yeah.
But I think European Union have Serbia and our president not need a wall. If you understand me, what I
I
want
do.
to.
John, I'm not sure about John,
Please
but I do.
help to translate.
So what do you think? What do you think? Is there a threat by a new massive wave of migration from the Middle East to Europe?
So two pieces. Let me do the wall. The wall's a campaign promise. That's why the president stays on it so much.
But is he going to build it?
No. But I believe in bridges, not in walls. And I think also, and I'm going to talk about it from the United States, and then I'll come over to the Middle East portion of your question. From the U.S. perspective, it is a lot better off to solve the problem in the countries from which people leave or depart so they don't want to leave or depart, rather than wait until they cross a series of successive borders. Because as a couple former leaders in the U.S. said, if we wait till they're on the Mexico-U.S. border, it's way too late. So a wall's not going to stop them. But a wall is a campaign promise, and if the drive is campaign promises and reverse all things Obama, it's easy to see the policy. So that's one thing. Two is, much the same way that I said I don't believe in coincidences for the caravan that's moving out of Honduras originally, and now a second one out of Guatemala, I'm not sure that the migration out of the Middle East into Europe is accidental either. And somebody has to unpack that, because one of the risks in this in every country is leaders will demagogue an issue because they need the issue to demagogue. So it is always better to have a threat as a reason to unify a population than it is to explain or justify the absence of individual freedoms or freedom of the press or human rights. Countries will always look for external threats in order to justify their existence. And therein lies one of the challenges.
All right. The last question, I'm not going to let you ask it. I'm going to use a privilege of being a moderator to ask the last question myself, which is something that we typically ask, that I typically asked, if you remember, all of the previous guests. I know it's a tough question, but I want you to answer it. Who do you think is the strongest leader of today?
So I'm not sure any leader has actually gone to the Olympics in weightlifting. So I think their discussion of strength may be a little disingenuous. I would have to, the strongest leader might very well be Macron. The ability to navigate all sorts of competing issues and advance his country's interest.
Well, that's an interesting answer. You're the first person who hasn't answered the Xi Jinping, but that's a very interesting point of view. I want to thank you, everybody. I want to thank you, John. Thanks for being with us this evening, and I invite you all to join us at the cocktail party. Stay tuned. There are 5 more years to go, at least, for the CIRSD.